Welcome to Globewatch with me, Charles Mundi, 8 from the best Western hotel here in Douala, the economic capital of Cameroon, where the Central Africa Business Energy Forum is taking place with one key idea: to streamline a policy for a sustainable management of the region's oil resources for the development of the entire continent, especially at a time when the African Continental Free Trade Market area is gaining momentum on the continent. What can be the role of the African Petroleum Producers Organizations as an entity in helping policymakers on the continent at the energy level to have a coherent strategy for the plus 1.2 billion people on the continent? My guest today on the program is the Secretary General of the structure, the Secretary General of the African Petroleum Producers Organization, Nigerian-born Umar Farouk Ibrahim. Welcome to the Cameroon Radio Television.
Thank you very much, Charles.
A quite number of African countries, if I'm not wrong, at least 7 of them, are part of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting or Producing Countries, which is, of course, the gendarme of the petroleum market globally. What is the production capacity on the continent currently?
Our production fluctuates between 6.9 and 7.3 in the whole of Africa. That is
billion or million?
Million barrels per day.
Okay.
Million barrels per day, out of which about 75% really is exported in the crude form, and just about 25% is refined on the continent.
Why that state of situation, where at least 75% is exported for refinery? Why?
Well, I guess we haven't given refining the attention that it deserves. We have been when you say Africa has energy poverty, I would rather say that we are not, we don't have energy poverty. We have a lot of energy, but we export it. Instead of having it for our own use, we export. I've just told you that we export 75% of the crude that we produce, and about 45% of the gas that we also produce on the continent. So if we are able to refine this and use it on our continent, I think the question of energy poverty will be a thing of the past.
When it comes to energy, there are so many factors that come into play. We can talk about oil, petrol, we can talk about gas, we can talk about electricity. Which one of them is more of a headache for the development of the continent today?
Well, currently let me say this. 2 years ago, the Council of Ministers of Apple, realizing that the world has decided to move away from fossil fuels, what you call the energy transition, commissioned Apple to conduct a study on the future of the oil and gas industry on the African continent in the light of the energy transition. And the study identified 3 major challenges. The first is funding. Essentially, it established that for the nearly 75 years or more that African countries have been producing oil and gas, they have not used their money to do this exercise. They rely on international oil companies and international financial institutions from Europe and America. And these are the countries to whom they were sending their oil and gas. The second challenge is technology. We have been producing oil and gas for nearly 75 years or more. And to date, no African country can say that it has mastered the technology of oil and gas from upstream to downstream. No, we are still dependent on foreign technology. And of course, the third is the marketing. We produce oil and gas essentially for export. Like I told you, 75% of our oil is exported. 45% of it is of our gas is also exported. And unfortunately, you find that you mentioned Africa having a population of 1.2. I think it's the more correct one is about 1.4. Out of this 1.4, 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity at all. And another 900 million do not have access to modern energy for cooking, for heating their homes, and for other domestic use.
We have seen over the years the situation of the energy consumption fluctuating on the continent, especially when it comes to one of the key drivers of the economy, which is petrol, for cars to move, for industries to function. What has been the role of Apple in stabilizing petroleum products on the continent?
I'll be very honest on this matter. I wouldn't say that, look, until recently, each of these, each Apple member country saw itself treated itself in silos. We were not looking beyond our boundaries.
A sovereignty question.
Exactly. And when people are so obsessed with that, this is my territory, nobody should interfere, for so long will it be impossible for you to make much progress. The sad thing about Africa is that we are ready to look outside of Africa, to relate with Europeans and Americans and others, but we are not ready to look to our neighbors to come together to partner to make something. Now, since the energy transition started, we have come to the realization that we need to pool our resources together in the oil and gas industry, in virtually everything, in order to be able to have access to the oil and gas that we have in hundreds of billions of reserves, as well as in our gas. So we are now making progress, and what you see today in Douala, in this meeting of CABEF, is testimony to the effort of CABEF and Apple to bring these countries together to construct infrastructure that will allow for energy security in the whole of the Central African sub-region.
Beautifully put. I bring back this question to you. At the level of Apple, which is like the gendarme for petroleum products on the continent, and there are multiple of them, and the market situation change each time depending on the global environment. In the 1980s, it was quite different. In the 2000s, it was quite different. In 2008, during the economic crisis, was quite different, just like during
Correct.
Just like during the current turmoil imposed by the war between Russia and Ukraine. What are Apple member countries on the continent doing collectively? Nigeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Algeria, to protect the African consumer?
Well, there are three challenges I told you facing the African continent, and we are coming together to resolve them. One, Apple countries are today negotiating with Afri-Exim Bank to establish what we call the Africa Energy Bank. When fully established, immediately this bank comes into operation, we are going to have $6 billion from the portfolio of Afri-Exim into our new bank. And then our member countries, their national oil companies, and the private sector are all going to be called upon to subscribe to this bank. We expect hundreds of billions to be able to have a solid banking system for the energy industry. Second challenge has to do with technology. Currently, a team from Apple is going around a number of Apple member countries to evaluate the research, development, and innovation institutions that we have in our member countries. The objective is we want to find a few that we can upgrade and designate them as centers of excellence, because it doesn't make sense for each of the 18 member countries of Apple. Each one says it wants to develop. We don't have the resources. But if we develop a few and we make them centers of excellence where each APO member country has a right to send its experts, interns, and fellows to go for higher training. That way, we pool resources together, and that's exactly what we're doing. And the third thing is a project like this. Our biggest challenge in Africa has been that of infrastructure. We have not been able to develop the infrastructure that will allow us to move energy from one point to the other. All the energy we produce move from the hinterland to the coast, from the coast to Europe or to America or to Asia. Now we are trying to develop something within us so that energy can move from Chad to Cameroon to Congo to Angola, etc., so that wherever there is a need for it, they just need to open the tap and it will be there.
Some time ago, I had a conversation with the Equatorial Guinea Minister of Mines and Hydrocarbons, and he talked about the future of energy on the continent being basically gas. At the level of Apple, do you agree with such an assessment? And is that where we should be putting some of the necessary resources for investments in the future?
Well, given what is happening now in the world with energy transition, certainly yes, it is, but we are also not discounting crude oil. Crude oil also plays a key role in a number of our countries, and we cannot just wake up because of energy transition, to say we are going to do without it. As far as we are concerned, given the amount of energy poverty on the African continent, we believe that all forms of energy are required to help us get out of this situation. It is only when we have been able to conquer this energy poverty that you can begin to talk about renewable energy or something. For now, our commitment is to provide energy to our people.
How much policy advice are you giving to APO member countries, and even those that are not part of the association, to invest more in refineries on the continent so that you produce your oil here, you process your oil here, you consume a majority of the oil here, and you only give to the external world finished products, just like you get finished products from them?
Well, all this have to do with financing. These are very capital-intensive projects.
Okay.
And like I said earlier, for so many years, since our independence, we've always concentrated on infrastructure or development, and we look at it simply as projects for our nations. Today, well, if you don't even look at it that way, how do you, for example, if Cameroon establishes a refinery of 1.5 or 2 million barrels a day, where does it take it to? Cameroon cannot consume 10% of that 2 million barrels, you understand? So it will need to send it out. So the first thing to do is to establish the infrastructure. And you can't transport this volume with trucks. It has to be a pipeline. And this is exactly what we are doing now. The Central Africa pipeline, if Cameroon is to produce 2 million barrels of refined products, and we have Central African pipeline, there's always a market for it. All they need to do is put it in that pipeline, and Gabon and all the other countries will just go for it.
In a moment, this interview will be coming to an end. But first, how do you relate events like the KABEF, which is taking place in Douala, to assembling minds, seminar minds, in producing the right policy documents for decision makers to clearly see where the problems lie and how to tackle them, insofar as the energy factor on the continent is concerned?
Richard, let me make it very clear. I don't think seriously that Africa lacks the mind or the policy papers or the right direction.
What is lacking?
Our biggest problem has been implementation or execution.
Okay.
You go to government offices, you find studies, very beautiful, but they are left unattended to.
So who should implement? I put the question to a policy maker like yourself.
Part of the problem had to do with the over-reliance on government for everything. Okay? In a situation where beautiful studies are done, given to governments, and they put it. If the private sector was involved and they look at the profit motive, they will not allow a study like that to go and die on the shelves. With government, when there are changes, various governments have different priorities. So when there is what we need are policy consistency and execution or implementation consistency. This is what has been lacking on the African continent.
You and I are living in an environment where energy shortage, acute energy, is a major issue. And I go back to oil and gas. You know of the situation in Eastern Europe. And we saw how in Europe decisions were taken at the level of the regional petroleum organization in the United States and whatsoever. What were the decisions which were taken at the level of Apple to make sure that there is no lack in the market? Because we saw a series of African countries scrambling in European markets to do overnight shipments to avoid a complete collapse of their economies.
Now, I think this is a very serious issue you've brought up. For many years, especially since Paris Climate Change Agreement,
2015.
Since 2015, Africa has been told consistently that avoid oil, avoid gas, avoid fossil fuels by the developed countries. All of a sudden, early this year, a crisis erupts between Ukraine and Russia. And the president of France, all the leaders of the West are rushing to Africa, asking us to produce the same thing that they have told us in the last 5-10 years to avoid, don't to produce. So the point we are making is this. These people define their national interest. And for as long as their national interest is concerned, nothing else is important. Now, somebody once asked me, how are you making the best advantage, taking the best advantage of what is happening between Russia and Ukraine? And I say, look, these people are coming to give you money to do pipelines in order to take your oil or gas to Europe. The biggest challenge we have today, and people don't see it, is this. The cost of oil and gas or energy is not because there is no energy. No, it is because Europe and America have sanctioned Russia. So that so many trillions or billions of cubic feet that come daily from Russia has been blocked. The same thing with their oil. But nobody is looking at it because there is a crisis. It's not the crisis that stopped the oil, because where they are producing the oil, it's not where the crisis is. But there is a sanction was imposed, and therefore today, Africa, we are suffering, because even those of us, Cameroon, Nigeria, Congo, that are producing oil, we find it a lot more convenient to export that oil in order to get the foreign exchange, because unfortunately we have developed a consumption pattern that makes it impossible for us to think straight. We are always looking what foreign exchange we have in order to be able to import either goods or services. Until we are able to discipline ourselves to do away with conspicuous consumption, importing base everything, we will not be able to be independent. So basically, what are we doing? Exactly what I told you. We are trying to establish a bank that is bring the money with which to do the projects, and those projects will be targeted for African people, not...
Mr. Secretary General, let's end with this. You possibly have nearly all the documents which have to do with the energy situation on the continent, and I'm just relying on one of the areas, oil and gas, because these are topics that I discussed with other policymakers in other areas, renewable energy, wind energy, and the whole of that package that goes with it. If you were to advise all African governments that this is the single policy that will take us out of the energy quagmire, as the Secretary General of the African Petroleum Producers Organization, what will be that single advice you can give?
Good. I will tell African leaders to begin immediately to consider how best to tackle the challenges I just identified. African leaders should contribute to making the Africa Energy Bank financially strong, so that we don't have to go to the World Bank or European Development Bank or any of these Western institutions looking for money to come and do our energy projects. 2, that bank will use the money to do infrastructure. For example, this Central Africa gas pipeline is one of the priorities we are going to give. We are going to do the same thing to expand the West Africa gas pipeline, East Africa and North Africa. By the time we do this, look, when you go to Europe, they don't have oil. Few of them have gas. Yet, the amount of pipelines, the number in terms of
Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2.
Everywhere, yes. They did that to ensure...
And the Atlantic pipeline, which links Europe and the United
Exactly.
States of America, just like...
These are done to ensure energy security. This is what is lacking in Africa. Even though we have the oil, we have the gas, but like I said earlier, the pipes run to the seas, and from the seas to... So let's look at Africa. For the first 5 years, maybe 10 years, it will be tough. But I guarantee you that once we are able to establish those infrastructure, we will empower our people. Once you empower our people, the potential for greatness is always there. What we are always told in Africa is, oh, the people don't have money to buy energy. Empower them to buy energy, and then the best will come out of them.
The Secretary General of the African Petroleum Producers Organization, with that optimistic point of view from you, we end the interview. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Umar Farouk Ibrahim, for being guest on Globewatch.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
What kind of memories do you have of the Queen as a media personality?
You know, I met Prince Charles when he came to Cameroon, and Princess Diana. And for me, that was the...
In 1990?
Yes, thereabouts. You know, that was the first real contact with the British monarchy. And of course, you know, during the time I spent in the UK, I was always intrigued by not so much the royal family as the Queen herself, you know. And believe me, I think she not only lived an extraordinary life, but she was an extraordinary woman. How, you know, how she could keep her self-composure, how she could look at the world with all of its, you know, the radical changes, the political movements, the upheavals here and there, and seem like the calm, you know, the one who could calm the storm at all times. I think she was an amazing person.
We are living in a world where we are at least 7 billion people, and out of that figure, nearly 5 billion of them are young people. Generally, they don't like old people, talk less of old people who spend so much time in power. The Queen spent 70 years on the throne uninterrupted. but she was a global celebrity. From a media perspective, how do you explain society's love for the Queen?
No, I think, it was more the, she had the ups and downs. You remember there was a year, I think it was in 89 or so, when she talked about the horrible year that she'd been through, where her metal was tested to the limit. So she'd had her ups and downs. But survivability, the Queen's ability to survive and to rise above those storms is what caught the attention of the world. And it's not so much about young and old, it's more about resilience. It's about life. It's about, seeing somebody like the Queen and even wondering at one point, will she ever die? So she kind of rose above a lot of what we, ordinary mortals, seem to understand about the life we live. And, so the Queen became something of a beacon, something of a star, towards which everybody would want to evolve.
She learned that she will be queen in an African soil, Kenya.
Kenya at the age of 26.
At the age of 26.
Yeah.
What kind of special relationship do you think was there between her and Africa? I know that she and Nelson Mandela could call each other by name, Nelson Elizabeth.
Well, those are all the those are the spices, the little elements that spice up life, and we would love to hear that. But the fact is, this was a woman born into a royal family. Nelson Mandela or anybody else was a man born into the poverty he was born into, but that the two somehow found a way to relate, to again point us to a higher order, our better angels. When two people of such different backgrounds could come together, it tells you that the world could, we could build a better world. That's what I see when I saw the Queen or the royal, late Princess Diana, for example, do what she did in Africa. All it told me was not of some magical presence. No, all it told me was, this is a world in which we can pull ourselves together, work together, and make this place a better one for everybody.